fellowship began last year with 6 fellows that did some work over the summer, presented their work over the fall, and then in the spring collaborated to create 3 different small conversations that we had, 3 different symposia that focused on Asian American studies and research by undergraduates, which is really exciting. So certainly if you are interested in the Fellows Program, happy to chat with you. Dr. Pillai is here. She would be happy to chat with you to learn more information. The call for the fellows will go back out in March, so think about it. I'm sure you'll find these 4 talks super inspiring and something that you'll want to pursue as well. So let's get started. I'm going to turn it over to our very first Asian American Studies Fellow, Sabrina Tian, who will talk about her work. So welcome.
Hi everyone, I'm Sabrina. I'm a senior studying design and cognitive science. And I've spent the last few months exploring or researching Asian migration through contemporary art in order to tell emotions and personal narratives. So before we really go deep into the information, I just wanted to give a brief roadmap of what I'll be talking about. So I started this project in a class last semester, and then it kind of led me to the fellowship. And then I'll talk a little bit about like my research methods. And at the end, I have a total of 10 artworks that I curated, but we'll only be going over 3 of them today. So this project actually started in March or April in my design class. It was called Art of the Web. And one of our final projects was to make a helpful site. And at that time, with all of the like anti-Asian violence and racism going on, I think one thing that really stood out to me was just the attention on Instagram. And I remember seeing this timeline of how like all of this violence traced back so far into like history. And that was something that we never learned about in school, and I just didn't know anything about it. And then at the same time, I do a lot of art myself. And so I saw a lot of these like Instagram story or carousels that would go through and tell like little day-to-day events that people had where they told their stories. And then in the comments, it was also like a little community of people being like, oh, me too, like that happened. And then also like seeking comfort. And so I thought it was an interesting way of how contemporary art has kind of changed over time and shifted into social media. From there, my project at the end of class was this timeline or archive of Asian American history that started from the 1850s and went until present day, where every decade would have or would feature an artwork or a series of artworks that connected to a historical event at that time. And since then, my project has been condensed from 18 artworks to 10, and also has shifted to focus more on Asian migration as well. But I think from there on, I was defining like 3 key like research questions. The first being, what is the migration process? Migration is something that's already been heavily researched within Asian American studies, but there are a lot of differences among the research. Some people say that there are only 3 steps, like pre-migration, when migration, and then post, and then some people define it to be 8. And so I was kind of exploring how like those steps can be merged together or even continued later on. And then another thing that I wanted to explore was, what is Asian American art? During my final project, we had to interview people. And so there was one student artist, she actually goes to Drexel, but she was talking about how she always felt the pressure of tying in like her Asian American identity into her art. She could never just like draw an animal and like post it and have people be like, wow, this is amazing and super thoughtful. She felt like she always had to make it go deeper and have it be layered with her identity. And so does Asian American art really need all of those layers, and what exactly like defines it? And then the last one is kind of just the intersection of the 2. I think art is very emotional and it can tell these very deep and personal stories. And at the same time, migration is something that not everyone will go through, but it needs to be understood. And so how can we use art to better understand it and have people empathize with those that have gone through it? And so just to go a little bit into my background, I only taken one Asian American Studies class. It was with Dr. Khan, Asian American Communities. I would highly recommend it. But other than that, I've just been involved in a few like AAPI focused spaces on campus. So this was actually pretty new to me to dive into like more academic research within Asian American Studies. And so over the summer, I started by doing my own little intro by reading The Making of Asian America by Erica Lee, and also by watching the PBS docu-series, and both of them I would highly recommend. But from there, I think it made me realize how, I don't know why I thought this, that like Asians only came to like the US, but how they also went to like South America, or even how like the United States, like their relationship with Great Britain would affect like all of these different immigrants and people that would come, and like the reasons why. So that provided a really good like overview into trying to figure out what I wanted to focus on. At the same time, I also wanted to look through the artworks, and so I created a database of 50 artworks, and just I wrote down like all of the basic information, like the year made, the medium, the artist, the nationality and ethnicity of the artist, but also I made these little tags of what that artwork was related to, and how interested I was in it on a scale of 1 to 5. And after filtering through all of them, I began to realize that whether it was like a data visualization of how a whole community has migrated to the US, or if it was about like the sense of belonging or the changing notion of like what identity and home means, everything that I was really interested in was actually related to migration, and that helps me narrow down a lot of my research and the scope that it was in. There are also some things that I tried to pay attention to when creating or curating these artworks. And so one of them was the range of professional training. Some of them are people who do art in a very corporate setting. They make it for like advertising, and then others have had professional like art training. They've gone to art school, and their work has been featured in huge like museums like the Smithsonian or MoMA. But I think the reason why I wanted to have this range was because art is just so subjective. Like, who are we to say that this artwork is good, this one's bad, this one has like more meaning? It's all like based off of our interpretation. And then I also wanted to have a variety of ethnicities, because I think at the end of the day, emotions are something that we all feel, and it was more about honing in on the commonalities of the emotions among the migration process rather than every person's individual story. And so that's also why I chose to do it through archival research rather than interviews. Because, well, another thing was because some of the artwork or artists had passed away and some of them were still alive. So it felt kind of unfair to like try and interview some over the other. But now I just wanted to go into 3 of the artworks out of the 10 that I ended up choosing. The first one being Before the Storm by Lan Qianlu. So one thing that she says was, some have a clear direction, but others are hurt and lost. Some lives are peaceful and others are turbulent, all captured in one painting. And here in the middle is the actual painting, and I also included some close-ups on the right. But basically, it features a series of leaves falling, where each leaf is a human. And some of the leaves look a little more destroyed than others. But her point that she wanted to make was that each of us have our own different upbringings, our life experiences, and our destiny. And this kind of these commonalities and experiences are like what ties us together. And so the artist herself, she's traveled and lived in many different cities, and rather than calling herself a like immigrant, she likes to call herself a global citizen. And so she's wanted to make conscious connections between people and places across cultures, and because of this, she feels that the world has become a smaller place, which has also shifted what immigrants think of different locations before they move. This is her on the bottom left. She's a Taiwanese American contemporary ink painter who explores universal themes and values that connect humanity as one across time and place. And her paintings have blended kind of that Chinese and Western modes of representation, but she still tries to adhere to traditional materials and techniques. And I think a lot of her paintings, even though they look East Asian, but at the same time, the meaning behind them relates back to her multicultural travels and focuses on what she feels and what she thinks other people can also feel just by looking at them, in order for us to all layer that like content and meaning so we can experience the same thing throughout her paintings. The next painting is called Electronic Superhighway by Namjoon Park. And this one's actually one of my personal favorites. And it was one of the first ones that I had found, and it made me really interested in how how immigrants view the US before they come here. But he basically augmented flashing images with clips of popular television in order to show how heavily influenced people in the US are by TV and popular media. On another note, he's also known as the father of video art, and so he coined the term electronic superhighway in order to recognize the potential for people to collaborate from all different parts of the world through media. So this is his actual artwork, and it's quite a big installation. If you can see, like, Texas is right here, and that's probably the height of like the average human. But it consists of 335 TV sets, 50 DVD players, 3,750 feet of cable, and 575 feet of multicolored neon tubes. And so when you first enter the gallery to look at it, it's just a very overwhelming feeling of how big it is and also how loud it is, since each of the TV sets actually like have audio. But when you are able to like look into each of the TV sets, he featured things that are widely played across the world that have affected like what others think of America. So like, for example, in Kansas, it's playing The Wizard of Oz, and in Arkansas, it's a clip from when like Bill and Hillary Clinton went to go visit. And those different like types of media have shaped what people who've never been to the US, like what the American experience is like. But at the same time, he really wanted it to connect to the physical road of both from Asia to the United States, and when people arrive in the US, how they move through different states, because all of this media has also homogenized the cultural diversity among the states and even like within them. And then a little bit about the artist himself. He was born in 1932 in South Korea, and then his family actually fled to Hong Kong at the start of the Korean War, where he then later studied in Japan and began his artistic career in Germany. So he's been all around, and then he came to the US just 9 years after the interstate highway system was constructed, so like the physical one. So I think he wanted his piece to mimic the construction of the time where like he came to the US, but also the rest of his works, they tie into how media is linked to the distinct identities and cultures both within and outside of the US. And then the last piece is Pause by Abdul Nasser Garam. And he is a Muslim, an Arab, and a lieutenant colonel in the Saudi Arabian army. And I think one thing to know is that he's actually not American, but when I was looking at his piece, it ties so much into the immigrant experience within the US. But basically, after 9/11, he felt that a lot of the world just was put on pause, especially after learning that 2 of the hijackers were former classmates. And so he's not trained as a professional artist, but everything that he does almost ties back to the notion of taking a pause and how these different upbringings the same upbringing will lead people down different paths, and exploring why that happens. So this is the piece. The 2 rectangles on the right over there represent the Twin Towers, and then he put them in a very like silvery color to make it look more ghost-like as after images. And then if you can see really small on the right side of the right rectangle, he added in a jetliner. So it's viewed to be either as taking off or landing. And then in the back, there are all of these little things that look like lines, but they're actually connections to the traditional Islamic architectural decoration with inscriptions of Muslim professions of faith that surrounds the plane's body. And in the background, he has rubber letters or stamp paintings that are either randomly placed or they spell out certain phrases. So one of the phrases that he included was one from the wife of the Flight 93 pilot, where she said, "If we learn nothing from this tragedy, we learn that life is short and there's no time for hate." And then you can see a picture of him on the bottom left, but his piece about 9/11 kind of shows that Muslim experience or Muslim American experience where before 9/11 there was this sense of invisibility, that nobody really paid attention to the Asian American community as a whole, but then right after this event they were suddenly highlighted and kind of there was just so much focus on the community that it made them feel more left out. And so it's interesting to see how the views of someone who's not American can very closely tie to what that experience is like. But I think after looking at these three artworks, what I've realized in my research is that this migration process doesn't necessarily end when a person or people reach their destination of like that country that they want to come home. Instead, it kind of is extended throughout their family, whether it's through their sense of belonging, their everyday experiences with microaggressions, or even their hopes for the future. So as for next steps, I have 10 artworks in total, and I've also kept looking at 3 more, so I have 4 more to go. But from there, I also want to start compiling all of this information to design a website for K through 12 education. But I think there are 2 other questions that I thought would be interesting to consider that I haven't really been able to focus in on. One of them being, how do the different reasons for migration affect people's sense of belonging within the US? Some people come because they're escaping like political or economic instability. Others are refugees. And then some just come because they have this sense of hope of what the US is like and they just want better opportunities. And so how does that expectation kind of affect their sense of community here? And then the next one is, how does migration affect different generations of Asian Americans, especially since I think a big part of it was just like migration is extended beyond that person who has like physically moved. So looking into and filtering data based off of the generations of people. But yeah, that's all I have for everyone today. Thank you for listening and feel free to ask any questions.
Talk about like your curating process, like how do you filter out different pieces that you were with
Sabrina, can you repeat the question just to make sure that everybody here, especially on Zoom?
Oh yeah. So the question was, how did I filter out all of the artworks and like narrow it down to 10 from the original 50? And I think it helps that I didn't really have like a topic to begin with other than I wanted to look at contemporary art or contemporary Asian American art and how that can tell like different events within Asian American history. So I think by creating the database, I was already like identifying things that I was drawn to, whether it was like the style that the painting was in or the like topics that it was about. But then really looking at okay, like these are the things that are tagged in each one, and then yeah, I guess it was very like subjective on my point, like whether or not I liked it, but then tying that to like my overall research topic, and then maybe looking at how other artworks could play into that.
So when you're creating the database, other than migration, what were some of the other like common themes that you didn't end up like focusing in on? Like what were some of them are like other general themes?
some of them were, oh, yeah, so the question was what were some of the other themes other than migration within the original database. I think some of them were just very focused on like identity, but not necessarily like tying identity to like a physical space or like journey. Some of them were also based off of community. And I think like at the end of the day, like a lot of the things could be tied into migration if they wanted to, but I think I just had to get like really picky about how they did that.
You mentioned that you would like this curation to be used in the educational setting. I'm just curious if you want to talk more about what you would hope students and viewers get out of seeing.
Yeah. Obviously I'm not like the, oh, sorry. The question was, because I want to make it into a website for an educational setting, what would I hope that viewers and students would be able to get out of it? And I think I'm not like the expert on this, but I wanted the website to kind of take people through that emotional journey that could go through migration. So they would first be able to like empathize a little more, but then also be led to more resources, whether it's like more scholarly resources or like docuseries like from PBS where they could explore more on their own.
Thank you for the presentation. And like, what made you like decide to like join ASAM, the ASAM like program?
Yeah, so the question was what made me want to join the ASAM Fellowship program. And it was really interesting because I started off with the project in my class and then I was interviewing student artists, and one of the feedback I got from my professor was like, maybe you should try to interview someone within the ASAM department. So I interviewed Dr. Khan and like kind of pitched my idea to her and asked her like what she thought about it. She gave me a ton of feedback for my project, but she also was like, you should consider the ASAM Fellowship. And after I thought about it, I really wanted to learn about all of this outside of class, especially since I'm like double majoring in cognitive science and design, so I don't have a ton of time, or I don't have a lot of classes or like free classes, and so it was kind of wanting to do this like on my own and exploring.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I was just wondering, you showed like 3 works of art. It was really like amazing watching you analyze them. What made you choose to present these 3 works rather than like the other 7 out of 10 that you're researching?
So the question was what made me want to present on these 3 works rather than the other 7. And the very honest answer is these are the 3 works that I like first researched. I think out of the 10 artworks, I split them up into like pre-migration, migration, and post-migration. So I wanted to do like one from each. And then as for like the rest of the 7, some of them are like architectural installations that like explore what home is in a very abstract way. There's another one that someone did with a collab with GoFundMe last semester, and that was kind of like on Asian pride and within the whole entire community, despite all of the events that were happening. So there's a wide variety, but yeah, these are just the first ones that I started out with.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Sabrina. I guess my question is, like, what made you initially get interested in this specific topic?
So the question was, what made me interested in this specific topic in the beginning? And I guess it started out with my interest in like art. I've always done art growing up, and I actually wasn't really interested in contemporary art before because I was like, some of these things are just like a block of color and you don't understand it. But I think after taking some of my classes, it was like once you take the time to understand like the meaning behind the artwork, like some of them get really deep, and it's just like how people have abstracted that. And then I think with everything that was going on last year, it was like how I saw all of these resources being put out on social media and trying to connect the two, because I do think that like art, a lot of artists like use their art to tell stories or their perspectives. So it was a really good way of finding out how they view these like events within history and tell that like personal narrative behind it at the same time.
Thank you so much. I mean, I am so inspired by this. I wonder, you know, the three that you chose, can you share their names again? Because like now I'm super intrigued. I want to go look up these different artists. And I'm also like I'm fascinated by, you know, the anti-Asian violence piece that you said you saw on social media and how people were expressing themselves on social media. Is there an example that you can maybe talk about so we can learn a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the question was, what were the 3 artworks that I featured, and they're just listed right here. I'll give you a few minutes to write them down, or I can send them to you later. But as for the artworks on social media, I think a lot of people started making these like little sketches with a ton of text, and it would be like, today this happened to me, or like in the past, this was something that had happened, but in the past, like nobody had felt the need to like say it or announce it on social media. And so it was just like a sudden influx of all of this. I have a slide from here. Yeah, so these are all of their like cover photos. But so like this one was like, what is the Asian American experience to me? The one next to it, it says, in 2019, I was punched in the face by a complete stranger. I was out in a crowded public space in broad daylight. I remember seeing that, and like the slides afterwards were like, despite the fact that she was in this public space in broad daylight, like nobody stopped to help her. Like everyone kind of just walked by as if it like either didn't happen or it was completely normal. And like with everything that was going on and all of these other people that were out there like sharing their stories, she finally like realized that this was something that like needed to be said. So
Hi, Sabrina. Thank you for coming. I have a question. What is the biggest challenge that you and your peers face while researching and studying about arts and Asian?
the question was, what was the biggest challenge that my peers and I faced? And I don't know if I can speak for the rest of the fellows. So I think one of the biggest challenges for me was just identifying like what my research topic and like thesis was, to like a very to be both like very broad, so it could be applied to different like areas, but at the same time like very specific, so I could finish it within this year. And I think it's interesting because like, at least for me, I felt like these are all things that just interested me in the past. So it kind of makes sense that it all came together like this. But it took a while. Like every week with Dr. Kalai, we would talk about like, oh, what did you learn this week? What did you think was interesting? And like finding out ways to narrow it down.
Sabrina, thank you for sharing the story of these 2 projects and the process that you went through to arrive where you are right now. And so to me, it's interesting how like both projects are examining Asian American art, and I wonder if you could share with us, after this like year of looking at it, what is your understanding of Asian American art?
So the question was, what is my sorry,
You're good. You're good.
what is my understanding of Asian American art? And I think it's something that's very broad and something that's also like maybe defined differently by every individual. I think after like doing this doing this research, Asian American art can be made on like topics within Asian American history or like studies, but if that person, like the artist, is Asian American, like I feel like whatever they create can be considered Asian American art. Like to respond back to that girl that I interviewed, like if she was out there and she wanted to draw like an animal and like call it a day, like that could also be Asian American art. So it's pretty subjective, but I feel like it just takes everyone a little time to like explore on their own.
Sabrina, I wonder if anyone on Zoom has a question for you. Hi, friends on Zoom. Feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question for Sabrina or comment or.
And if you want to drop it in the chat, we'll read it aloud. Whatever you're most comfortable with.
All right, well, certainly you can reach out to Sabrina. If you think of something afterwards, that would be great as well. But thank you so much for your talk and all your work. Really, I learned a lot, and Sabrina's here for a couple more minutes if anyone has questions. So thank you so much for those guys.
Wait, there's it's applause. Yeah, no question.
That's my mom.
Thank you, everyone,
Thanks
for
for coming.
All right, so we do have lunch. Feel free to grab something. There's chicken. There's CHX, and